morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. I am Adedayo, Olofinnika, and I'm going to be your host on this webinar today. As possibly have known, this webinar is about discipline without fears or trauma. Discipline without tears or trauma. Proven ways to correct behavior without shouting, threats, or fear. And we have a very wonderful speaker who is going to be our guest on the webinar today. Before I bring her on, I would like to give a brief introduction of what this webinar is all about. As we know that the ages 0 to 8, most important years of children's life, and we see that these are the foundational years where children grow and develop. And as parents and adults around children, we have a major role to play, particularly parents. There are certain ways we raise our children, and sometimes this leads to frustration, leads to some challenges. And that's why this webinar is coming up, so that we're able to see some strategic ways we can go about our parenting journey. Before I bring in our speaker today, I'd like to give a brief about her. Miss Sarah Rosen-Sweet is a certified peaceful parenting coach, speaker, and educator based in Canada. She is the founder of Reimagine Peaceful Parenting, where she works with parents around the world to help them build more connected relationships with their children while guiding behavior without punishments, threats, or fear. Sarah specializes in peaceful parenting approach that emphasizes empathy, connection, and collaboration between parents and children. Through her coaching courses and educational programs, she supports families in moving from frustration and power struggles toward more confident, respectful, and cooperative parenting. She's also the host of the widely followed Peaceful Parenting podcast, where she shares practical strategies and insights to help families navigate everyday parenting challenges with empathy, respect, and clear boundaries. Through her work, Sarah has helped thousands of parents across different countries to develop healthier communication with their children and create calmer, more supportive home environments. Please join me as we welcome Miss Sarah Rosen-Sweet. Sarah, you're welcome to our podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So it's such a joy to have you on the webinar, and we're very grateful for accepting to join us. Now, we're going to begin with the webinar. I'd like to find out, as many parents want to discipline their children without shouting, yelling, and then, all the threats. But sometimes in stressful moments, it can feel very difficult to stay calm,
Mm-hmm.
From your experience working with families around the world, why do parents often fall back on these reactions, even when they know they are not the most effective?
Right. Well, I think it comes down to the nervous system. So our nervous system, are the part of our brain that's always, our amygdala is the part of our brain that's always trying to keep us safe, looking for safety or danger, right? So if you were walking, through the woods and a tiger jumped in front of you, your brain activity would quickly shift. Your brain would detect the brain and nervous system would detect the threat, and it would quickly shift into fight, flight, or freeze to keep us safe, right? So you don't want to have to stop and think, gee, what should I do? There's a tiger. Your brain automatically takes over and assesses what's the best reaction. And then, whether it's fight the tiger, run from the tiger, or play dead, right? The thing is that our amygdala can't tell the difference between a real threat and something that just feels like a threat. So our nervous system and our amygdala responds the same way to a tiger as it does to a child who's saying no, I won't, turn off my video game, or I'm not going to get my shoes on, or, you're the worst mom ever, or whatever. Our nervous system responds in the same way and goes into a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And that's because those feelings that we have, and so every parent has different triggers. I just mentioned too, your child being defiant, right, is one, or your child not listening. And every parent has different triggers depending on what, their own personal history is, or, the ideas they have about how children should be. And so if your child is acting in a way that is upsetting for you, or triggering for you, that is going to be an overwhelming feeling that you have in your, emotional, right? An overwhelming emotion. And that sense of overwhelm of our own feelings, I'm trying to talk slower because I talk really fast. So I'm trying to slow down a little bit. But our own emotional overwhelm registers as a threat for our amygdala and our nervous system, just like a tiger would. So that's why it's so hard to stay calm. Even if you think, I don't want to yell, I don't want to shout, and you're, feeling calm, as soon as you get a trigger, if you don't work on it and practice, and this doesn't always have to, parents can work on their triggers and they can work on their reactions. Awareness is the first step to recognizing when you get triggered. You can actually bring yourself back to calm, or stop yourself from having that fight, flight, or freeze reaction to your child. And so that's why our nervous system taking over the emergency response is why parents act in a way that they don't mean to, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. Yeah. So you often speak about peaceful or connection-based parenting. How would you explain peaceful discipline to parents who worry that it might mean being too permissive or letting children get away with bad behavior?
Right. So I'll start with a little story. When my oldest son, who's now 25, when he was in high school, he said to me, Mom, so many of my friends don't, they don't tell their parents where they're going. They don't answer their phone when their parents call. They might not even go home at night. And he said, you're really lucky that I care what you and Dad think. And to me, that encompasses the heart of part of peaceful parenting discipline is it's about the relationship, right? So if your child cares what you think, especially when they're a teenager, that connection is how you can influence your child, right? So what he was basically saying is, my relationship with you and Dad is important, and so that influences my behavior, right? With little kids, I want to make sure people know, like, if you have a small child and you do have a good connection and they still aren't doing what you ask them to do, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a bad relationship, because they still have, their brains are still developing. They still have impulse control issues. They still have, that process I was describing earlier of the fight, flight, or freeze happening. We just call that generally dysregulation. So a child, even if they're connected to you, they will have dysregulation. So just if you're listening and you think, oh, Sarah's son said, I care what you think, maybe my kid isn't connected to me because they're still not listening to me. But that's the big idea, is that we are parenting with that connection and that relationship in mind, because the older a child gets, the more important that is, right? As they're younger, I guess you could think of it as, the more autonomy they have, the more, the more they're out in the world. And, little kids, you can, if they're not listening, you can pick them up and move them somewhere else, right? It's time to leave the park. You pick them up and put them in the car. As they get older, you don't have that control anymore. And I'm not recommending we use control like that over kids, but when they're young at this age, you said 0 to 8, this is when our chance to learn how to influence and build that connection. So as they're getting older and we don't have control anymore, we do have that influence. And so I think that, that's in terms of discipline. If you start to think about discipline as teaching, which is really the root of the English word of discipline, comes from to teach. If someone's a disciple, they're following the leader, right? Because the leader is teaching them and guiding them. So if you think about discipline as teaching rather than how it has come to mean as punishment, that also will help you get into that mindset of peaceful discipline. And now I've lost track of the original question you asked, and I'm not sure if I answered it or if the if I went off on a tangent. But let me know if that
No, no,
answered the
no, no.
question. Yeah. So really,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
want to
yeah.
think
I
about,
understand. No problem.
yeah, little kids. We're thinking about guiding them and teaching them and building that connection with them. So as they get older, we have that influence, and they want to follow what we're, our family, our family. I can't think of the right word right now, but they want to follow us as they get older because we've built the teaching, guiding discipline as they're younger.
It's all right. Yeah. So when children display challenging behaviors, such as tantrums or
Mm-hmm.
refusal to listen, or a form of emotional outbursts,
Mm-hmm. I
what
can't
is
tell.
usually happening beneath the surface from a child?
So sorry, can you glitched out a little bit? Can you repeat the end of the question? When they're having
Okay.
tantrums and meltdowns, then what?
Yeah. So what as a development expert, child development expert, what do you think is really happening beneath the surface from
Right, right.
that perspective with a child
Sure.
now?
So it still is the nervous system. The kids experiencing that, just like I talked about with an adult, like it's not any different. The overwhelm of their own emotions are setting off their fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And the fight, the kicking and screaming, the flee, maybe they run away from you when they're upset. We hope we don't see the freeze, because that's often, a kid who's really withdrawn is not, maybe they're more withdrawn because they haven't gotten the response they needed from the fight or the flight. But really, that dysregulation of the nervous system is what we look at as meltdowns or tantrums. Then there's also just crying because they're disappointed or sad, which I would say, sometimes parents don't. I don't know if we need to differentiate them, because we would treat them the same way in terms of trying to meet the need, trying to let them know that they're understood, empathize with them. But really, a lot of what we see as quote bad behavior, a big cause of that is that nervous system dysregulation.
All right, thank you. So, but experiences, we see that many parents interpret these children's difficult behaviors as disobedience.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
how can parents begin to see behavior
yeah.
instead as communication?
Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about one of the big ideas of peaceful parenting, that if you don't understand or believe this, it's really hard to guide children without punishment or yelling or shaming. But I want to I want to share that children are doing the best they can, right? We often like to say they're not giving us a hard time, they're having a hard time, right? So if you have a child who's disobedient, how can you reframe that to that there's something going on that's stopping them from cooperating with us? As humans, we evolved to be connected to a caregiver. Like that's we're biologically wired for a connection with a caregiver. So that is what ensured our survival as humans. Back in the caveman days, if there was a flood and nobody cared about you, and you were 1 year old or something, and you couldn't run away yourself from the flood, your survival depended on some connection that you had with a caregiver who would pick you up and bring you along with the people because they loved you and cared about you, right? So we're actually, the way our brains are wired and our nervous system is wired, we are wired to connect with our caregivers. So if a child is acting, and I'll just say disobedience is out of connection with a caregiver, right? It feels like they're making you mad and they're not doing what you're asking them to do. And there are a whole host of reasons why that could be. But we like to say in general, they're having a hard time not giving you a hard time, right? They want to be good. And people who have a hard time not resorting back to punishment often believe that their children don't want to be good, and that's why they need to use punishment or consequences, whatever friendlier word you want to use for punishment. They need to do that because otherwise they'll never learn, quote, right? They'll never learn unless I take something away or inflict some measure of pain on the child, whether it's literal pain or just taking, yelling at them and making them feel bad or taking away their toys or whatever it is. If you don't believe that children want to be good, you're gonna think that you need to use a punishment to teach them a lesson. But what I always say is, yes, there is a lot of teaching that needs to happen and there are a lot of guiding that needs to happen, but nobody needs to feel bad in order to learn. Like I could say to you, like, if you made a mistake and I, yelled at you in front of everybody and told you you had to stay late at work, that probably would not, not only would it not help you do better, it would make you feel terrible about me, right? And it would hurt our relationship. So we believe that we ourselves don't need to be made to feel bad to learn something, but somehow we still think that children need to be made to feel bad to learn. And I would suggest that kids can learn without feeling bad. And there are sometimes, as parents, we need to guide them. We need to support them and scaffold them. And I think I'll talk about that. I saw one of your questions was having to do with that. But we need to provide the guidance and support that they need and to, get the cooperation they're looking for. And I also want to say, when we're talking about disobedience, sometimes we're not being reasonable as adults. Sometimes we're not being, flexible or looking for compromises. We might have an old-fashioned idea of children should just do what they're told. And obedience might feel like a very attractive quality in a 4-year-old. It'd be real handy if your 4-year-old just did everything you told them to do. But most of us would say that obedience isn't a quality we want for our adult children, right? Like you don't think, oh, I sure hope my son grows up and just follows orders and just does everything that everyone tells them to do when they're a grown up. So we sort of magically want them to be independent thinkers and, standing up for injustice and say something when things are not fair. And, we want them to do all of that when they're grown-ups, but we somehow don't want them to do that when they're kids, right? So sometimes there are, and sometimes kids get it wrong, and they might protest something that's actually quite reasonable, but they're still learning. Their brains are still developing. They want what they want, which is, as I said, it feels inconvenient, it feels annoying. And also we want to think long-term, what kind of human am I trying to raise here? Am I trying to raise somebody who just follows along with the crowd and does what they're told? Or do I want somebody who's going to, especially the world we're living in now, stand up for injustice, say something when something is wrong? We tell kids at school to be an upstander. I don't know if they do this in Nigeria, but in North America, if you see someone being bullied, you're supposed to be an upstander and say something instead of being a bystander and letting it happen. Well, if kids don't learn how to do that at home, then they're not going to be able to do it out in the world, right? So we really want to think about reframing. I'll just summarize, reframing disobedience as that kids are having a hard time, not giving us a hard time. There's something standing in the way of them, being cooperative, whether it's their feelings are overwhelming and they're having that fight, flight, or freeze, whether it's they just have their own ideas of what they want, whether they're tired or hungry. I mean, that's something that parents it's very easy for them to see when their kid is not doing the right thing, like, oh, well, they, missed their nap or they didn't sleep well last night. Like, but that kind of acknowledging low on resources can be in other areas too, right? Maybe they're feeling disconnected because you have a new baby or, there are lots and lots of reasons. So just really recognizing they're doing the best they can. They want to be good. And also that as parents, sometimes we need to think about, rather than just expecting, we say, you do this, we think about what we're asking. Is it reasonable? Is it developmentally appropriate? Is it necessary? Because we tend to, as parents, we tend to like our own ideas and we think things should be done a certain way. But can we be flexible, right? Can we, and I'm not talking about being permissive. I'm talking about like really just setting limits around health and safety. Like, who cares if they do it this way instead of that way? Or, can we really not have an extra 10 minutes to play at the park or whatever?
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. Could you share 2 or 3 practical strategies parents can begin using immediately when children refuse to cooperate or ignores instruction outrightly? Can you share 2?
Sure. So I always like to think of, and hopefully people can see my hands. So we have on my right side, like our expectations for what our child should do, right? So the expectation, they should go and put their pajamas on when it's time, or they should, go and pick up their toys when I ask them to, or whatever it is, right? The expectations that we have for our child. On my other hand, my left hand, I have the reality. They're not picking up their toys when I ask them to. They're not going to put on their pajamas. In conventional parenting and conventional discipline, parents rely on yelling, threats, shaming, consequences, or even bribes, to close that gap between the expectation and reality. If you don't want to parent that way, you can't just, and those are tools, right? Yelling at a child is a tool to get cooperation. It's not a tool I would recommend, but it is a set. Those conventional parenting practices are a set of tools. If you don't want to parent that way, you can't just drop out those tools and expect life to go on. You have to replace those tools with another set of tools. So in peaceful parenting, we talk about, instead of yelling or whatever to close the gap, what support does my child need to close that gap between expectations and reality? And I will get to a couple of practical tips, but if you can just replace that thought in your head of instead of what consequence do I need to give them to get them to cooperate, what support do I need to give them to get them to cooperate, right? So, and even before we think about that gap in expectations and reality, we want to ask ourselves the questions I just said. Is it necessary? Is it age appropriate, developmentally appropriate? Can I be flexible about this? Because not only I promise I'll come back to the tools, but not only when we do those things, when we're not power tripping, because we have a lot of power over kids, right? They don't have any money. They can't live on their own. They pretty much rely on us. So we do have a lot of power over children. And if we use that power consistently, if we are, I always say power tripping, arbitrary, controlling, we are chipping away at the relationship with our child, right? Because they know, they really know it's not a big deal if you say, no, we're not doing this thing, and they know you could, and they just know you're using I can't think of an example right now, but they know you're using your power over them, right? So if we are doing the opposite of that, we're being flexible, we're taking their preferences into account, we're listening to them, we're treating them respectfully, we're trying to, make it work for them whenever we can. We're doing what I call putting deposits into the goodwill bank, right? And that goodwill bank is what you're building as your child is getting older, right? When you can control them when they're younger, but when they're older, you can't control them anymore. And so you're building up this goodwill bank where you're not using your power over them when you want to try to close that expectation gap, right? So that's really important as kids get older to have that nice beefy goodwill bank. And even when they're younger, I remember one time, this is a silly example, but when you have a beefy, big, full goodwill bank, even if your child disagrees with what you're asking them to do, when they know that most of the time you're pretty, flexible and trying to make things work out for everyone, when you do have to say, I'm just sorry, this has to happen, this is just the way it is, they're much more willing to trust you, right? Even if they don't agree with you, even if they don't like it, if you have that beefy goodwill bank, they're more willing to trust you. And a silly example is my son, who's now 21, when he was 8, we were going to my sister's wedding, and she really wanted the kind of beautiful, picture perfect wedding. And the boys were wearing, dress clothes, and she really wanted them to be dressed up. And my son wanted to wear his sneakers, like his tennis shoes. And he really did not want to wear the uncomfortable dress up shoes, right? And he's very strong willed, and he was saying, I won't wear these dress up shoes. They're uncomfortable. I want to wear my sneakers. And I said, listen, I know you don't want to wear them. And also, it's really important to your auntie. And because it's important to your auntie, it's important to me. So will you wear the dress shoes? And he said, yes, I will wear the dress shoes. Because he had this experience of me not saying you have to do this and you have to do that. And he trusted me, and even though he didn't agree that it was a good idea to wear the dress shoes, he agreed to do it because our relationship was important to him and the goodwill bank was nice and full, right? So back to those tools when your kid is not listening. And not, because when we say not listening, really we mean they're not doing what we ask them to do, right? So there are a couple things that you can do. First of all, as I've said 3 times already, stop and think, is this really necessary? Is this a health or safety limit or a, mental bandwidth limit for me? And if it's not, maybe be flexible or let go and think, okay, I'm putting deposits in the Goodwill bank, like Sarah said. If you decide, yeah, it is really necessary, think about what support does your child need to meet your expectations. So I gave the example of not picking up their toys. And you might want to think, okay, well, really for a 6-year-old, that does involve a lot of executive function and organization. And they really don't even want to clean up their toys in the first place, because cleaning up the toys means it's time to get ready for bed, right? So really recognizing that your child has a different agenda than you do. They want to keep playing. You want them to stop playing and clean up and get ready for bed. So what can you do to find a win-win solution? One thing, we talk about win-win solutions. They get some of what they want. We get some of what we want. So, and I also just want to say right off the bat, peaceful parenting is a lot of work. and it is a lot of work, but also I saw when my kids were going through their teenage years, I saw how much problems some of their friends were having, like bad problems, like drugs and alcohol and crime and like going off the rails, bad problems. And we had lovely teenage years. So what I'm saying is the work that you put in when they're small, you can either put in the work when they're small or you can put in the work when they're older, right? So putting in the work now when they're small and, doing this more sort of parenting that requires more of you is worth it, because it is going to make things easier later on. So I'm just going to say that right off the bat, that it is easier to yell at your kid to get them to do something than it is to do what I'm going to ask you to do, which is, do that scaffolding and that support to close the expectation gap. Way faster and way easier to yell. But you have to ask yourself, big picture, is this what I'm trying to build? Big picture, right? So maybe they're not cleaning up your toys. You're like, okay, let's put on a song and see if we can work together to get all of these toys cleaned up before the song ends. Or maybe it's, let me get you started. I used to do this with my kids all the time for cleaning their rooms. Let me get you started and look around. Okay, put all the books on the shelf and then come and get me and we'll look at the next step, right? Because as I said, it does take that executive function. So if you can be playful and make a game out of something, or even I gave the example of not wanting to go and get their pajamas on. My middle son, he tends to be the one I tell all the stories about. He's the most intense out of my kids. But when he was little, he loved monkeys. For 2 years, it was like everything was monkeys. And if I said, okay, baby monkey, he was probably 5 or 6 or whatever. Baby monkey, it's time to hop on the mama monkey's back and we're going to go and get your monkey suit on, right? And so we go upstairs and he puts his monkey suit on, which is really his pajamas. Oh, what do monkeys use to brush their teeth? And, you can do that, sort of the themes that your child likes, being playful to get them to go along with what you're asking them to do. So that's a really great strategy for younger kids. And always, there are other strategies too. So, getting playful, thinking about what scaffolding do they need, like the cleaning of the toys example that I gave of, start with this, giving them something to work towards. So, all right, as soon as we get this playroom cleaned up, if we do it really fast, we'll have time for 3 stories instead of 2, right? If you're trying to get ready for bed. And, another thing is to help them to understand the why. That's really big, especially as kids get older. So you know what? And we always want to lead with empathy. We always want to start with empathizing. I know you don't want to stop playing and clean up your toys. It's so much more fun to keep playing. Cleaning up is not usually very fun. And if we don't clean up your toys, if I have to get up in the middle of the night and I step on one of these toys, it might hurt my foot or it might break your toy. And, we really want to make sure that we keep everyone safe, or, whatever the reason is that why you want to do something. So helping them to understand the why can be a really big part of that, getting cooperation. And so another thing that you can do is ask for help to solve the problem. You know what? I know you don't want to get your jammies on. At the same time, if we don't get to bed, you're going to be so tired tomorrow. You're going to be so cranky if we don't get to bed. And I know you don't want to get your jammies on. Do you have, and I know we've been arguing, and do you have any idea for how we can solve this problem? And a lot of times kids come up with creative solutions if we just listen to them. I'm trying to think if there are any other like big tips that I talk about.
It's all right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you so much. For our super parents who are on this webinar, please, I would like you to drop an emoji or a comment to say yes. If you're actually following us and you're getting one or two tips in your parenting journey, please go to the comment section and say yes. And please feel free to drop your questions, because after the session, we would take one or two questions from our online audience and from all our super parents. Peradventure, something drops in your mind or you have a questions that might be bothering you, please go to the comment section and drop your question, and we'll take the questions immediately after this time. All right, so Sarah, how can parents, in practical terms, set clear limits and boundaries while still maintaining a warm and respectful relationship with their children? How?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to reiterate what I said about not using our power when we don't need to, because I do think that part of limit setting is when you have a trusting relationship with somebody and you feel, the connection piece. Kids are much more likely to, as the example with the wedding shoes, they're much more likely to follow what we're asking of them if they feel that we have their best interests at heart and they trust us and we have been, practicing peaceful parenting. So, I always say you want to start with that, and hearkening back to your first question about yelling. That's always where we start too, with working on our own self-regulation. Cause you could try any of the strategies that I mentioned to you about, cleaning up the toys. But if you're triggered and angry and, you're not bringing the right mindset and the right calm to the situation, it's not going to work. So limit setting is almost like the last part, right? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like we want to work on our own regulation. We want to work on our connection with our child. We want to work on that goodwill bank and making sure that we're not asking them things that are, just because we like it that way and we have more power. So we always want to ask ourselves when we're setting a limit, is this necessary, age appropriate? Can it be flexible, et cetera? I've said it a few times. And then when there really is a limit that we need to set, we never need to be mean about it. We can be kind, we can be empathetic. We don't need to ever be mean about any limits. And, and often what I find is that when you're doing all of this, kids are pretty willing to go along with what you're asking them to do. I'm not sure I answered that question, because there are, yes, you can, if you say it's time to get ready for bed and they're not listening, you can pick them up and move them up to their room. You can do that. You can, I've talked to parents, they lose their cool and they're kind of roughly putting the kids' clothes on them. You could call that limit setting, like, oh, the limit is they need to get their pajamas on and get ready for bed. But you're really using force, right? So ideally we want the limits to be things that kids are choosing to go along with because of all of the work we've done to set the stage with them. And there are, sometimes where they don't like what we're asking and they have a meltdown and we have to wait through the meltdown, and that, I don't know if you have anything more specific you can ask me about limits or boundaries. I tend to not talk about limits as much as I talk about teamwork and collaboration. This is our goal.
Okay.
This is why we do what we need to do. This is why we try to get enough sleep every night so our bodies grow while they're sleeping. It makes us feel good the next day. Trying to get the kid to understand. So we're collaborating rather than just setting a limit about now it's bedtime and you need to get your pajamas on.
Okay. If I get it very correctly, Sarah, so that means the emphasis should be on that collaboration between the parents and the children, instead of just setting limits or.
Yeah. So it's you're always empathizing.
Right. So what are,
sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so based on your own experience as a mother and as an advocate for peaceful parenting, what are some small daily habits that parents can adopt to strengthen connection with their children and reduce behavior problems over time? Yeah.
Okay. One is take care of yourself. It's really, really hard to be compassionate and patient if you are low on resources and exhausted and stressed. So really, like, trying to take care of yourself is a big part of this kind of parenting. It's really hard to do it if you don't have resources. And I don't mean, I just mean like you're not hungry, tired, stressed. Like, if you don't have those kinds of, if you're not feeling calm yourself and good and, at least relatively rested or whatever, it's hard to do that. So taking care of yourself is actually a big part of peaceful parenting. And another part of peaceful parenting, a daily practice is the self-compassion practice that we talk about. There are going to be moments where even if you don't want to yell, even if you don't want to shame or use consequences, there are going to be moments when you mess up and nobody's perfect. And if we beat ourselves up about the mistakes that we've made, or even if anyone's listening to this webinar who is realizing that that they haven't been practicing the kind of parent that they want to be in the past, you have to forgive yourself for mistakes that you've made. And it doesn't mean that you stop trying. You're not like letting yourself off the hook, but forgive yourself for being human and messing up sometimes, because nobody's perfect. So one thing I like to say is, even though I messed up and yelled at my kids 3 times today, I'm still lovable and worthy, because that's what's going to help us do better in our daily life with our kids, is if we are coming at this for this sense of self-compassion, and we're going to keep trying and we're going to keep practicing and showing up, but we don't have to be perfect. And we're also transmitting that to our children while we're living that too, right? So those are 2 sort of things in the background, I think, that set you up for being sort of, I'll say, quote, successful, peaceful parent. And some other things that we want to think about, I feel like I've said this maybe 6 times now, but being flexible and thinking of collaboration rather than obedience. And then the other thing is working on that relationship. And maybe this is, the 2 places to start if somebody is trying to transform their parenting. One is their own self-regulation that I mentioned, and the other one is working on connection. And if you are trying to shift from conventional sort of fear-based discipline, you're shifting from fear-based discipline to peaceful discipline, you might not want to drop those things out quite yet until you have worked on your relationship, right? Because you do need to, connection is a big part of being able to use peaceful discipline. I said, your kid has to want what you want and care what you think. So, do that first. Don't try to do everything all at once. Try to work on your relationship. And of course, punishment does hurt the relationship, but there's got to be a transition at some point. So connection strategies, I love our sort of gold standard of peaceful parenting is what we call special time, where you have 15 minutes a day, just one-on-one time with your child, where you say something like, I'm all yours for the next 15 minutes. What do you want to play? And you just play with them. You don't have to go to a special place or spend any money or, do anything other than just like play with them in the yard, in the park, in their bedroom, like just playing for 15 minutes. That said, I realize that's a tall order for some families because they're really busy and there's not much time during the week because everyone's, school and work and all of the things, or maybe you have a little one that won't leave you alone with the older ones. So, if you just try to get it in your week at some point, like ideally you do it every day, but if you can only do it on Saturdays because you've got your mother comes over on Saturdays and she can watch one of the kids while you're playing with the other kid, do the best you can to try to get that one-on-one play time with your child, because that is the love language of children, is play. And when you play with them, and you don't need to play with them for hours and hours, I'm just saying, half an hour once a week, 15 minutes, just these small chunks of really tells kids, you matter to me, right? You see me, you matter to me. You're going into their world for that small amount of time. So that's one thing. And, there are also ways that we can build connection that I call it's like the low hanging fruit, like the micro moments of connection where you do what we call delight in your child. So delight in them is let the love that you feel in your heart show on your face. So your child might come down for breakfast in the morning, and instead of like, we're 15 minutes late, hurry up, get your breakfast, the time to get to school, you say, just take a few seconds and just like give them a smile, or even say, good morning, my darling, sweet child, before you head into all of the things that need to happen, right? So really just taking time throughout the day. It really, all it takes is a few seconds, a few times a day, and some intention to delight in your child and let them see how you feel about them and that you actually truly delight in their presence and you love them and like them. So that's a really good place to start in terms of like building that connection.
It's all right. So thank you. Now, the next question I would like you to help us take is regarding families with multiple children. In families with multiple children, conflicts between siblings are common.
Mm-hmm.
So what is a healthy way for parents to handle siblings disagreements, while
Right.
within the family we have two, three or more. So
Yeah.
what's the healthy way for parents to handle sibling disagreements?
Sure. So I have three kids myself, so I know about the sibling conflict. And I will say my 21 and 25-year-old, I mentioned that they're independent, they live on their own. They live together. They're roommates, which they have an apartment together, which just makes me so happy that, they're best friends, even as adults, right? So I think one of the things to think about is that when kids are fighting, there are two main reasons they fight. One is because they don't have the skills to negotiate conflict with each other, right? They don't actually know how to come to a solution. If they're fighting over a toy, they don't know how to work it out. That's one, and I can come back to that if you want. But the other main reason that kids fight is because they're trying to see who you love more. It's the sibling rivalry is about scarce resources. Do mom and dad love me more, or do they love my sibling more? Is there enough for me? Will my needs get met? Do they often experience, like, when we add to our families, for us, it's a beautiful thing to have a new baby. For them, it's like, why did they replace me? Like, they already had me. Like, why do they need another kid? Right. And sometimes that can go on through childhood, where the kids are really in competition for that parental love and attention. So if you have kids who are fighting a lot, I go back to the special time, I go back to the delighting, go back to working on your connection and your one-on-one relationship. A way to reduce that friction between the siblings is for each child to know, I am loved, I am appreciated, they see me, there's enough for me, right? So that's one thing, is working on the relationship. Back to the conflict negotiation. If we go in and solve their problems for them, they don't learn how to solve the problems themselves. And also it drives the rivalry. So say you have two kids fighting over a toy, and you think who started it, you think you know what the answer is, hey, you, child A, give that toy back to your brother, right? Child A thinks, child A is resentful of child B and thinks, I'll get him, like mom just chose him instead of me, I'll get him. And child B is thinking, haha, I won, right? And so it's like driving, if we go in and choose one kid. And I want to stress that even if we're right about who caused the problem, even if we're being fair, if we go in and we're what I call judge and jury, if we go in and say, like, you get this, you get that, then we're driving the rivalry, and we're not helping them with the conflict negotiation. That said, if you don't intervene, sometimes you get physical violence, or you get one child who thinks, I might as well not even try because this child, my brother always gets his way because he's the dominant sibling or whatever. So we do need to intervene, but we need to intervene in a way that is helping them speak to each other. So we want to think of ourselves as, like, instead of the judge and jury, we want to be the mediator. So a mediator just helps two sides talk to each other. The mediator isn't suggesting solutions or saying what's going to happen. So we want to try to solve sibling fights by saying, like, whoa, I see like two kids here fighting over a toy or whatever. Like, what's happening? What's going on? And we try to get them each to say their side of what happened. And like, wow, no wonder you're fighting. You both think it's your turn for the toy or whatever. And then you want to say to them, who has an idea for how we can solve this problem? And you want to take their ideas and help them talk to each other and come up with an idea together of how to solve the problem. And that's actually teaching them those conflict negotiation skills that they need with each other and in life, right? And kids will often do this naturally on the playground because they know if they're not flexible, that no one will want to play with them. But with a sibling, they know their sibling is their sibling forever. And so sometimes they need a little guidance from us of how to negotiate whatever the conflict is happening.
All right. Thank you so much. So just before we take questions from our audience, super parents, let me take this other question. For parents watching today who may feel stuck in constant power struggles with their children, what is one mindset shift or daily practice that could make the biggest positive difference in their home today?
Right. So
what can they start doing differently?
A mindset shift is sort of the one I was telling you about before, is they're not giving me a hard time, they're having a hard time, because that really helps us go into interactions with support rather than feeling like support and patience, right? When we're recognizing that they're having a hard time. And in terms of the power struggles, everything still applies of the things I was saying before about looking at, is this really necessary? So looking at the expectation first, and if we decide that it is, how can we find that win-win solution? So a lot of times what I find with my coaching and with my parenting is that when we stop and we think like, really, does this have to happen? Or, can I be flexible? Often the answer is yes, that you can be flexible and that you can let go of your end of the power struggle. Even with, I'll see parents sometimes who, they just need to say, this even happens with my daughter who's 18 and who lives at home still. The other day I said, can you go to the store? She was going to be near the grocery store. And I said, can you go and get me a few groceries? And normally she would say yes, no problem. But she was feeling cranky that day. And she was like, I don't want to. I already have this to do and blah, blah, blah. And instead of talking more about it with her, I just kind of left it, right? I just kind of left it for her instead of digging in. And she came to me and said, okay, I can go to the store. No problem. I'm sorry. And she even apologized. I'm sorry for being cranky with you about it. I'm feeling stressed about this other thing. So sometimes a power struggle, if we even just leave it and go away for a little while and you tell the kid yes, I do need you to do this thing. And we just, instead of insisting on standing there until we get a, yes, I will do it, just kind of backing off a little bit, letting them cool off, think about it. And that often will solve a power struggle too.
All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think we would like to take some questions from our audience. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Someone asked, I think...
there is a question I see about a child remaining disconnected, even though the parent has been peaceful and providing guidance.
Oh yeah. Is there any other tool to use apart from the ones already mentioned, or are there other resources that one can refer to or something?
Yeah. So
for further learning.
Right. If that person is still on the call, I'd love to know how old their child is.
Okay.
Lossie, are you still on the call?
Lossie from Sierra Leone.
Yeah. If you could say how old your child is, that might help.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
All right. Thank you.
This really very much educative, and we have learned a lot from you. We appreciate you for. So yes, like I was saying, peaceful parenting actually involves a lot of energy, time, and patience. Yeah. However, I wanted to know if there are also other tools that we can use apart from these that I already mentioned, like you are saying, or if there are other platforms, maybe we can also consult for more resources after maybe this meeting that we can also continue to learn from, because this is really very hard for us, especially in Africa. So it's like we are starting intentionally to dismantle our model of approach towards children, how we can really continue to, nurture them. So that's just what I wanted to know. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Other resources. Well, I have a lot on my website of blog posts and podcasts. I have a podcast that has I think we're at 225 episodes or something right now, which as just sometimes just listening to the same things, on repeat and the same ideas, it really helps you to sort of learn more and have it become natural. The person that I trained with, her name is Dr. Laura Markham, and I think her website might be, maybe you can check that for me. I think it might be peacefulparentshappykids.com. But she has also, she's wonderful, and she also has a lot of blog posts and different things on her website about peaceful parenting.
Yeah, if you can drop your link in the group so that we can also follow, like you
Sure,
said,
yeah.
so we can learn from other posts. Yes.
Yeah, and if anyone, I have a weekly newsletter that I send out, which always has some sort of, I tend to send out like something to reflect on, like an idea to reflect on. What I really find is that this is sort of twofold. One, they're the tools, but the mindset is really important too. And I think, Lassie, that's what you're talking about, is like, especially in Africa, you're shifting like a different it's culturally different. I mean, and also like North America is very culturally different from this as well. Like North America is still very like the authoritarian model of children should be seen and not heard, and they should do what they're told, is still very much widely like what I'm doing is still very unusual even in Canada or in the United States. And there are a lot of people who talk about gentle parenting, but still children are seen as almost second-class citizens in North America too, in terms of that they should just do what they're told and not have any rights, and people shouldn't listen to them. So we're sort of, I believe that this is how we're going to change the world. It's very slow, and hopefully it's not too slow. But I really believe that this is, we raise a generation of kids who are thoughtful and kind and compassionate and think about other people. Because really, I'll just close. I mean, I can keep talking, but, one of the problems with using punishment is it teaches you to only think about yourself, right? So if you do something that hurts somebody else and then you get a punishment for it, the emphasis is not on how your actions have affected other people. The emphasis is on what happens to me when I hurt somebody else, right? And a lot of kids who, when punishment is used to try to change behavior, they don't learn the lesson of how does my behavior affect other people. They just get better at being sneaky and lying so that they don't get in trouble, right? They don't have that internalized, I want to do the right thing because I understand what the right thing to do is, and I understand how my actions affect other people. And I want to be the kind of person in the world. And when we treat them that way too, when we treat them with respect and kindness, they want to go out and treat other people with respect and kindness. So I think it's like a big part of this is just like, you want to show up with your child the way you want your child to turn out and be in the world, right? There's a wonderful article that some other parenting person wrote that's called Model Graciousness. And often, a kid's like, you said, okay, clean up your mess. And they're like, I don't want to. And like, okay, I'll clean it up for you this time. I bet you'll help next time. And you want to show up as that person who's nurturing and helping and caring, and not somebody who says, it's your mess, you clean it up, I'm not helping, right? Yeah. So it's really living this sort of different way of being with children in terms of like being, instead of being, okay, this is a good way to think about it. If I weren't afraid of what was other people think, if I weren't afraid of like, oh my gosh, they're going to turn out into a person who never cleans up their own messes. If I could just react from a place of love, what can I do that shows love in this situation instead of fear or control? What would I do in that situation if I can just think about showing up with love, right? And showing up with care and nurturing. My kids were extremely what my husband even in the time would call coddled, right? But do you know that word coddled? And it has a very negative connotation that you don't want children to be coddled. But the real meaning of coddled is to treat with care. Like that's the original meaning of coddled, is to treat with care. My children are so like, I was just talking to my mom this morning on the phone, and I was telling her that I had dinner last night with my 21-year-old. And he had asked me, Mom, do you want to get a coffee or do you want to have dinner or something? And I said to my mom, I said, he's so attentive. And he really is. Like, he's 21. He's this like really like, like guy who's got a lot going for him, and he's still like checking in on his mom. And really, I think that the care that we show is what comes back to us, and what goes out into the world with them.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think Vikrant raised his hand. Vikrant, please unmute and let's have your question.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Your insights have been nothing short of exceptional. I think I'm going to pose a question that's slightly different, right? Given the fact that I come from a society wherein you're stuck between the confines of being raised in a capacity that's socially acceptable, or you're stuck between this thin line between being modern as a parent or you're traditional as a parent. So I believe something that I wrote down, and allow me to read this verbatim, please, would be many parents today want to break this generational cycle while also raising resilient children, as you posed to multiple times when you were speaking. How do you practice peaceful parenting in a way that builds emotional safety without unintentionally removing those kinds of challenges that we know for a fact help children develop resilience that lasts a lifetime?
Yeah. So resilience, I always think resilience is not that our kids never get upset about anything. Resilience is that they can handle setbacks, challenges, frustrations, and they recover, and they don't feel like they want to avoid those things because they're too hard, right? Part of how we build resilience in kids is that, first of all, I'll say, if you have a child who's like, I want the red cup, not the blue cup. You gave me the milk in the blue cup. I would change the cup to the red cup if I could, because there are so many things that come up in the life of children that we can't change. They can't decide what they're going to eat. They don't decide when they're going to go to bed. They don't decide if they're going to go to school or not. I would say, 80% of their lives is controlled by adults, even if we're being peaceful parents. They don't get to watch TV for as long as they want. Like, all of these things that we're doing that are health and safety limits are enough frustration for them that they experience that building frustration tolerance and experiencing resilience, right? So we can both know that there are enough bumps in the road, because I think that's what you're talking about. Like, how do we make sure that our kid can handle like the bumps in the road? Do I have your question correct? Like,
yes.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
a part of it, but I love your insights on this as well.
Yeah. So there are going to be enough bumps in the road that our kids get naturally just because they're kids. And then we also want to think about, this is another big piece. Are we rushing in? Like, if they encounter a problem or situation, are we rushing in for our own comfort or because they actually need us, right? So stepping back, letting kids figure things out themselves. I just did a podcast that came out yesterday with Lenore Skenazy, who started the free range kids movement about 15 years ago. She made headlines by letting her son take the subway by himself in New York City when he was 9 years old. So a lot of raising kids who are resilient and not sheltered and not like the helicopter parented kids is managing our own anxiety of like letting them do the things that they want to do, letting them be independent. Of course, you're not going to throw a 9-year-old on a subway who hasn't been taking the subway every day for their whole life, and that you haven't practiced and talked about what they would do if they got lost. And like, so we're doing the scaffolding, right? But a lot of why kids are overprotected today is because it's the parents' own anxiety and own fear and own discomfort. So get out of our own way is part of the answer, right? Like, let them experience things, let them make mistakes. There's a famous quote from the American author Mark Twain, and he says, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. So there is a certain amount of like, we were talking about power struggles. Your kid wants to wear, they don't want to wear a jacket when it's cold out, and you really want them to not be cold. And instead of forcing them to wear the jacket, hey, how about if we put it in your bag and you decide if you're cold or not? And maybe they even refuse that and they're cold all day. But they've learned, right? They've learned something. And it's not, we let go of our end of the power struggle, let them experience a little bit of hardship of being cold, even if we preferred that they wouldn't be cold. And we let them learn things themselves. So I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of peaceful parenting that really is, there's a lot that's leaning in, and there's a lot that's stepping back and letting them experience things, even if we don't think it's a great idea, when it's not actually life-threatening. Even letting kids play in risky ways, climbing trees, playing with, like, we gave our kids pocket knives when they were around 7 years old, and they used them supervised, but they did whittling. I don't know if that's something you did as a kid, but kids aren't allowed to do anything dangerous anymore. And so really just letting them have that free play, do things that make us a little nervous, let them make decisions that have real life consequences. That's a big part of that building resilience.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
very
sir.
much.
And but why we're at this, and I'm sorry, sir, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question, right? Like a little bit of a follow up to what you just stated. What are your thoughts on the day and age that we live in today, with technology taking over in tremendous capacities, wherein you have this phenomena of iPad kids becoming a reality, and parents just taking a step back from actively parenting as opposed to peaceful parenting? Is like, if you're involved, you're peaceful parenting. But now
Yeah.
there's this disassociation with the whole concept of being an active parent in the first place.
I'm
Do you have
incredibly
any thoughts on
distressed.
that?
I'm incredibly distressed by how much kids are on screens. I wish that people would not get their children personal devices. Obviously we're talking to each other on a screen, and it's amazing that we can do this, halfway around the world. I don't know where you are, but it's amazing some of the things that technology can do, and talking to grandparents on FaceTime. And also I am very worried about how much time kids spend on screens. And I wish that everyone I'm distressed that, I don't know what it's like where you live, but in North America, most kids get given devices in school now, like Chromebooks that they take home. The Chromebooks don't have any way to put parental controls on them. And the kids are supposed to be using them for their homework, but they're on YouTube. You can't block YouTube because they use it for school. I'm incredibly distressed by it. Like, I think it's changing our brains. I feel myself affected by my screen use, and even though I try not to, right? So I'm very worried about it, and I wish that we could put the genie back in the bottle. I see 2-year-olds in strollers in the park looking at a phone instead of playing or looking around them, and it's very sad, and I'm very distressed by it.
Thank you for your time, Sarah.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. So thank you very much, Sarah. And please, I would also like to state here that we are planning on having another webinar on the issue of early exposure to digital tools for young children. So hopefully would come up with that. And this is a real serious threat to children's development, and it looks cut across everywhere all over the globe. So, and a lot of researchers are also working to see the adverse effect of these on children's development. So hopefully very soon we'll be coming up with a webinar on that. Exactly.
Look up Let Grow, because that Let Grow is Lenore Skenazy's new foundation, where they're trying to bring back childhood play and independence. And they have some really cool programs that are free for parents and for schools about trying to bring back free play. And she says, if you listen to my podcast with her, you'll hear her talking about this. She says that kids' first choice is not screens. Like, their first choice isn't screens. Their first choice is play with their friends, but they don't have the opportunities to do that anymore. And so we're worried about screens. We need to provide more play and more free play for children. So I think that's like a good antidote to think about. It's not just like we're taking their screens away. It's like, well, we're providing for them what they actually truly want and need, which is social time and playtime.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. I would like to take the last question before we go. Someone asked, Fumilayo, how can you manage passive aggression on your children when you are under stress? How do you manage that?
Yeah. So, I do have a free. Are you going to send out some resources or let people know? Because I have a free course that's called How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids, which really helps people to manage their triggers. And so this person seems like they're talking about their triggers, like they get aggressive when they feel stressed. And so my free course has just a real good plan for how to start recognizing what your triggers are and how to heal your triggers and how to respond in a different way. So it's hard, and it does take practice, and it's hard, and our brains are wired a certain way, but our brains also can rewire to have a different reaction than our immediate reaction. So hats off to you for wanting to do something different, and it's never too late. And, you can repair with your kids, you can work on different responses yourself. And I think for anyone that's got, anger management problems or stress, that starting with my How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids class is a good place to start. It's on my website, which is reimaginepeacefulparenting.com.
Thank you very much. On this note, we would like to bring the webinar to a close. Thank you very much, Sarah.
You're welcome.
For coming on board during this webinar. And we want to also thank all our online participants who joined in the webinar today. We hope that you've been able to learn one or two things about how to raise children without necessarily yelling or without any trauma. And I hope that all the lessons learned from this webinar, you'll begin to put them into practice. And very soon, or one of those days again, we'll come again with something very insightful that you can use and in your parenting journey that will help you a lot. And we hope that by the time we put up the call, you would come again to join us.
Sure.
Once again, I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate you. We hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you very much, everyone. So on this note,
I just want to say, okay. Thank you to all the parents out there who are trying to parent in a different way than they were parented and trying to parent in a different way than what they see around them. Because I think it really does make a difference, both with your own family and in the world. So thank you to all of you who are wanting to learn about a new way of parenting and try a new way of parenting.
All right. Thank you very much. We appreciate you so much. Thank you, everyone. On this note, we'll bring the webinar to a close. Thank you.